Canada is now in a federal election campaign, with doors being knocked from coast to coast to coast. And presciently timed ahead of this, just a few weeks ago, the Business Council of Alberta delivered its election platform, A Strong Canada, A Good Life. Today, I'm joined by BCA President Adam Legge, who you listeners will also know as the host of C-Suite Unplugged, the other Alberta Better show, to talk about that piece and what kinds of policies we hope get debated on stages and discussed at doors over the next several weeks during this election. Now, Adam, you prefaced this report by highlighting much of the growing sentiment in the country, especially among young people, that they feel Canada is on the wrong path and has been for some time. What supports that view?
It's one of those rare moments, Scott, where for many decades we were talking about how life was getting better and metrics were that you would generally be more prosperous or well off than your parents. And I think we finally hit a turning point here. I mean, less than a third of Canadians feel that the country is on the right track. Less than 5% of Canadians think that the next generation will be better off. That's a terrible
5%.
Less than 5% feel that they'll be better off. I mean, we for decades have been viewing life as we'd always be better off than our parents. And we now have 95% of Canadians feeling that that will not ring true going forward. Interestingly enough, more people believe in Bigfoot. Think the next generation will be better off. More than half of Canadians think that economic growth does not make them better off. So there's something that's not ringing true with how people feel that they will benefit from economic growth, or when we talk about economic growth or policies that incent or spark economic growth, they're not seeing it flow down to themselves and their paychecks and their pocketbooks and their genes and their well-being. And we've seen broadly the economy stagnate. We've seen GDP per capita decline 8 over the past 9 quarters. So you can't help a Canadian to feel like they're just not doing better. If you mix all of that together, there's probably a very strong sentiment that we're just not on the right path and haven't been for quite some time.
Mm-hmm. Some pretty striking numbers in there. I mean, even just the fact that so many Canadians don't equate economic growth with their own benefit was really a big and important realization for me as well. We can't just say, oh, we'll do this and the economy will grow and think that everyone's necessarily going to think that's a good idea.
Yeah, it's viewed as it benefits an upper echelon of society, you know, the 1%ers and others, and that the average Canadian doesn't feel that they're going to be richer a year from now than they are today, or that if we invest in infrastructure, or if we make sectors stronger, if we trade more, all of these kinds of things, that people aren't seeing the connective tissue. And so A, we have to do a better job of talking about the connective tissue, and B, even more importantly, we have to create the connective tissue, because this just hasn't been there in Canada for the past decade.
Okay, so those are the problems. Let's talk about how we create that connective tissue then. This initiative, this policy platform of proposals, is one of the council's flagship initiatives for the year. Tell us about the name. What does it mean?
Well, it's meant to reflect really 2 things. One is that sentiment that people don't feel like they are achieving the good life that they feel was part of the Canadian promise for many, many decades. So we want Canadians to feel that the next government has put in place policies that will deliver a good life. But we're also now faced with the existential challenge of our former friend and ally, the United States, now taking some very serious and severe consequences and actions against Canada. That's what the Strong Canada is about, is that we are strong and resilient in the face of turmoil and challenge, particularly from our closest friend and ally. And that strong Canada, when we build ourselves up and when we do better and we focus on an economic agenda, we enable that connective tissue to be shown and created for Canadians, that they'll have that good life. They want a strong Canada. They're fiercely patriotic right now, standing up and elbows up for Canada. They want it, they deserve it. They also deserve a good life, because we haven't been delivering. And if we're getting 95% of Canadians thinking that the next generation won't be as well off as the current generation, then they're not seeing the good life. So this is a policy platform that gets Canada back in the game. It builds ourselves up from what we should have been. We took our eye off the prize for 10 years, and getting ourselves from a position of strength, and then also enabling that position of strength to deliver better for Canadians and to give them a good life.
One of the things I really like about this platform is it's truly a nonpartisan platform. You know, when you read through it, you can sort of see that these are things that make sense to do regardless of who Canadians pick to form the next government. And the Strong Canada and a Good Life policy platform. So it's based around 3 pillars. And I thought we could just briefly touch on each of those for the benefit of the audience. The first is build and trade. Adam, what's the prescription for how to get Canada building and trading?
We've frankly just, part and parcel of this whole piece about just taking our eye off the economic agenda. We have failed to realize that Canada is blessed with an abundance of natural resources and that the world has come to our shores over the past 10 years asking for access to our natural resources. And we've told them no, or we said there's no business case. So, and it's harmed the country. It has harmed Canadians. It has made us poorer and worse off. So building and trading is about how do we build the infrastructure that get our natural resources to market. That's everything from agriculture products, forestry products, critical minerals, oil and gas, LNG, food products, you name it. This is a broad-based natural resource export strategy to make sure we have plenty of markets to get our products to, because we are now seeing the consequences of being beholden to one large customer. They're holding us hostage. And we really don't have a lot of other places to go because we are so limited in our export capacity. So it's getting those major projects built, whether it's our pipeline infrastructure, our ports, our air cargo capacity, our railroad stability, certainty, predictability. All of that needs to be built. It needs to be built quickly. So we need to fix our regulatory approvals and permitting system in Canada, which is still too slow, too unpredictable, too fraught with political interference, and making those decisions so that CEOs can ask for money from their boards of directors and do it confidently, knowing they're going to get some certainty and predictability on the timing. And then finally, recognizing that we are a country of resources and supporting their growth, supporting their development, ensuring we're continuing to be protectors and stewards of the environment, enabling economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and appropriate consultations, but getting those products and commodities developed, added value, and then exported to future markets.
To existing and new ones. Yeah. Talk about the second pillar, because I think this is really interesting. Not always the very first thing you'd see on a business organization's list of policy priorities. What do you mean by investing in ourselves?
Well, for too many years, we have done a number of things that have harmed our human capital, our human potential. The first is we aren't creating the right systems for training Canadians. And that goes across, frankly, all skill levels, occupational levels. But we've done particular damage at the more local level with the changes to the labor market agreements between provinces. The funding has been rolled back on those. So many very important, meaningful programs that train people in the skilled trades, new Canadians, underrepresented populations like women, Indigenous peoples. Funding for that has been cut. So we're really harming those who have great potential for skilled trades, skill education and training. We have let our immigration system run amok. We are not putting in place good criteria for ensuring that we're getting the best and the brightest around the world. We're giving more credibility to a PhD in Latin than we are to a skilled trades person or to an engineer, simply because our scoring system is just off. And we are then not setting those new Canadians up for success by not enabling the funding into the communities, and also doesn't follow them on secondary moves. So it's a very fraught system. And finally, we're making some early progress, but we still have much more to do on Indigenous economic reconciliation in terms of making Indigenous peoples and communities full equity participants in major projects that benefit their communities. The early initiative of that was the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. The federal government has now modeled that with a federal program, but it's still been too slow to develop, too slow to materialize, and too slow to actually invest in any project. So how do we create then capacity within Indigenous communities to assess and identify and evaluate opportunities in their communities for economic growth, and then support them by creating equity backstop and participation opportunities to enable them to chart their own path as they should many decades into the future?
I think one of the positives that's come out of this, this sort of period in time with a lot of turmoil in it and a lot of uncertainty, is Canadians finding a little bit of their spine and backbone and competitive nature. And that's reflected in this Strong Canada Good Life and the pillar compete and win. A Canada that's actually willing to talk about wanting to win at things. Tell us more about that. What do you mean by compete and win?
There's no way that we can be a prosperous country where people feel that they're better off next year than they were this year if we don't view ourselves in a competition. And whether that's in a competition for people around the world, for talent, whether it's a competition for jobs and investment or economic activity, we have to understand we're in a competition. So we have to be competitive. And we have not. We have created barriers to investment, barriers to job creation, barriers to growth by our tax structure, which is archaic and hugely cumbersome. It's a disincentive to invest in work. Our regulatory system, which we've already talked about, is a huge not open for business sign. We put in place policies that frankly are discriminatory to certain sectors, like the oil and gas emissions cap, which is penalizing and punitive to one region of the country. We've got silly problematic policies like the greenwashing provisions that were passed recently last year that really will stifle Canadian innovation and investment. We aren't letting tankers go into other parts of the country to get our resources out to market. So, I mean, there's this the litany of all these things that are basically ignorant to what is going on in the world, ignorant to what our most competitive economy, the US, south of the border, is doing, and placing us, frankly, in our own self-imposed penalty box when it comes to competitiveness on the ice with respect to economy and investment. So we need to really recognize that we can't do anything in a vacuum, and that we have to be cognizant, particularly what the US is doing. That should be the biggest benchmark for what Canada does in terms of its policy environment, so that we don't continue to lose out to the US from an investment job creation standpoint.
I hear this all the time from our members and CEOs that when it comes to competitiveness and, policy environment and also environmental policy, what we need to be thinking a lot about is the United States. I hear CEOs say all the time, we can't get too far out of step with what the United States is doing. Otherwise, the dollars just suck one way or the other, and it's usually south.
Yeah, and one that, obviously is sort of the elephant in the room is the carbon price in Canada. We know that it's unlikely that the US is going to be putting in place a carbon price anytime soon. Alberta was the first province in Canada to put in place a price on carbon, and I think the large companies of Alberta generally have accepted that and embraced that and understand it's a part and parcel of global capital and capital markets. But we have to recognize that our competitor in the South does not do that. And so I think that's why there's a lot of research and dialogue and discussion around the future of Canada's industrial carbon price. But, that tax rates are another big factor from a US comparison. So it's a whole broad basket of issues. And we've just largely focused on non-economic priorities over the past decade as a country, frankly, to the detriment of investment and economic activity.
And now, as you talked about in the opening, it's really affected Canadians' prosperity, and they're really noticing this. One of the things I often hear in election campaigns is people say, I don't feel like I know enough to ask politicians questions when they come to my door, when there's a forum in my neighborhood or something like that. And so one of the things that I really like about this platform is it includes 10 actual needle-moving ideas, things that would advance the policy agenda, advance the economy, advance people's lives. And they also make for some pretty great questions that you could ask somebody at one of your doors. So I thought we'd just go through kind of a lightning round of 3 or maybe 4 of those, time permitting, and talk specifically about what we might want to see happen here. The first one that I want to ask you about is something I hear just every day these days, which is about interprovincial trade barriers. This went from the most boring policy file to like the top of the list. What do you think can be done to actually knock down these interprovincial trade barriers that we've been talking about for so long?
It's political will is what it boils down to. So the provinces need to come together and the premiers need to take action. Alberta has been a leader with that under former Premier Jason Kenney in 2019 with removal of a number of exceptions in the Canada Free Trade Agreement. We're seeing some progress on that, but quite frankly, the federal government has some tools it could utilize to incent the premiers to take action to match Alberta. Those would be things like transfer payments that they have to be either contingent upon removal of some of the trade barriers and labor mobility barriers that are currently established in each province. Other sources of funding, infrastructure funding, et cetera, can be tied to the removal of these barriers. So it's going to require either political courage and will from other premiers, or it's going to require the federal government to be very hands-on in terms of driving that change through other tools that they have at their exposure.
A little bit earlier, you mentioned some of what's gone wrong with our immigration system at the moment. And I feel like there's a real parallel between how Canadians are feeling about the overall economy. For decades, just being able to count on the fact that next year would be better than this one, your kids would be better than you. And similarly, I think Canadians for decades counted on the fact that immigration works great in this country. And then in both categories over the last few years, some folks have woken up and said, boy, this isn't working as well as I'd like it to. What are some tangible ideas to fix the immigration system?
Well, first and foremost is restrict some of the temporary flows that we've had. The federal government lost complete track of, frankly, the count of international students, temporary foreign workers. So we found out that while we had targets of 500,000 immigrants a year, we were upwards of close to 1 million temporary people between students and temporary foreign workers. So it just got completely out of hand, and that drove a lot of housing availability and affordability issues. And so Canadians' sentiments on immigration really turn. So I think first and foremost is count your people properly. 2 is reform the criteria, make sure that we're picking the best and the brightest, that they're actually have demonstrable proof points that they will
skills our economy needs,
existing employment and income in their home countries, etc. Making sure that the funding flows to the settlement organizations, and if they do make a secondary move, that the money also follows them to the secondary location. Increase investment in skilled trades and other programs of high demand. So if there are immigrants that are coming to Canada without as much skill, get them into skilled trades programming and enable them to be in the workforce really quickly. And then finally is recognize credentials better and faster. We have a real problem in Canada with credential recognizing bodies being somewhat protectionist and not recognizing foreign credentials quickly. That has the proverbial PhD driving a Uber or something like that, where they could be far more productive in an engineering role or a doctor or something like that. So let's get those credentials recognized quickly and get them in positions so they're not underemployed.
That story of the super qualified person driving an Uber, I mean, every single Canadian knows that story, has heard it dozens of times. It's time we do something about it. Let's talk about our third and final of the needle movers that we have time for today. I want to ask you about another topic that business organizations don't talk about all the time: strengthening our military, borders, and Arctic defense. How should we go about doing that?
Well, we know that's a major irritant for the U.S. is that they feel, and rightfully so, that we've basically outsourced protection of North America to the United States. We've languished in our investment. We're the lowest funded NATO partner in that consortium. We have dragged our heels on new equipment purchases, etc. And it has been something that people shied away from. And now we find ourselves in a volatile world with wars in Ukraine, in the Middle East, an uncertain future with our U.S. partner. We need to invest and deal with that irritant, frankly. We should be at 2% for NATO spending, if not more. And so we need to step up and do that quickly. We have to recognize that increasingly the Arctic is the new frontier. Russia is our largest neighbor on the Arctic front. China has interests and illusions of being a near Arctic power, as they call it.
Near Arctic.
And that there is increasing incursion in that space. And there's a lot of fear from the Americans that something could be deployed in the Arctic by a very undefended Canadian vast territory and increasing sea routes and things like that. So we have to step up, not only to be a good NATO partner, but a good neighbor to our American friends in the South, live up and address that irritant, but frankly, to protect our own sovereignty in our own country, something we have just not done and have ultimately outsourced to the United States for too long.
All three of these topics we've just touched on, interprovincial trade barriers, immigration, and defense. Part of the urgency driving each of these is the rally to the flag moment happening because of the challenges with the United States. What if things simmer down and the relationship smooths over and we're not getting as much pressure from the United States anymore? Will the enthusiasm around these things decline? Should we not do them?
We absolutely should do them. All of these things that are in this policy platform and the Strong Canada Good Life platform are things we should have done over the past 10 years, which we simply haven't. And they're all good for Canada, regardless of what the U.S. is doing to us right now. So we would be in a far better position if we had an economic agenda, had focused on competitiveness, had invested in trade infrastructure, unleashed our natural resources, et cetera, et cetera. And so none of this should go away if the U.S. turns around and goes, just kidding, everything's good, we're back to normal. The last thing we want to do as a country is go back to sleep on any of these issues. We should treat them as national imperatives. All of them, to some degree, are national emergencies because we have languished for so long on all of these things. They are all important to Canada for our future, regardless of what is happening in the United States. They are all in our best interest. They're all about protecting our future. They're all about creating a strong, resilient, independent, sovereign Canada. And they are all things that ultimately will give Canadians that better life.
Sounds good. Check out Strong Canada and a Good Life at businesscouncilab.com. And Adam, thanks for the chat today.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. We'd also love to connect with you on social media. Hit us up on any of the major social media platforms and check out the latest of our work. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and tell someone else about the show. Your support means the world to us and lets us keep making podcasts. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to podcasts.